Good morning, Faith Community. We're continuing our series here on the hope of Christmas. You know, we learn to hope from the Old Testament. We learn to hope from the Israelites who were constantly being reminded, look forward, look forward, look forward. And today we're looking at 2 Chronicles chapter 36. And 2 Chronicles 36, it's really sort of a summary and this looking forward. It's this moment where in Israelite history, everything has really fallen apart. Now, as you're reading through the Advent readings, we're sort of jumping ahead when we jump to 2 Chronicles 36. So let me do just a quick recap. We've sort of skipped through 400 years of history. Now, remember that I'll give you a date here. You don't need to remember this, but about 970 BC, Solomon began building the first temple. Well, after Solomon built the first temple, about 722 BC, the northern kingdom goes into exile. They go into exile into Assyria. But now at the end of 2 Chronicles, this passage that we're looking at is right after King Josiah has died. Now remember, King Josiah, he's the last good king in the southern kingdom in Judea. He's the last good king who follows the Lord. He follows the Lord with all of his heart. It says during Josiah's reign, they celebrate Passover, and no Passover like that had ever been celebrated in Israel. So Josiah is a good king and he pursues the Lord with all of his heart. But then something happens. Pharaoh Necho comes up from Egypt to go and attack Assyria, but Israel is right in the way. And as he passes through, Josiah decides to not let him pass through. He gets in his way, and in doing that, he dies. He dies in battle, falls to the Egyptians. And Pharaoh Necho comes to Judea and he sets up his own king. So it's a little confusing right here at the end because we have a series of 3 different kings. So let me explain it to you really quickly. So after Josiah dies, his son Jehoahaz becomes king. But then Pharaoh Necho arrives and he says, no, Jehoahaz is not going to be king. I'm going to set up Eliakim as king. Now, this is a little confusing, and you need to jump back and forth between Kings and Chronicles to realize this. But Eliakim has his name changed by Pharaoh Necho. Pharaoh Necho says, Eliakim, you're going to be king, but I'm going to call you Jehoiakim. So it's a little confusing when you're reading because you read about Eliakim, you read about Jehoiakim, same person. Pharaoh Necho changed his name. So Eliakim's name is changed to Jehoiakim. And then what happens is a new power rises. The Chaldeans. Now, the capital of the Chaldeans is Babylon. So you'll hear the talk about the Chaldeans and the Babylonians. It's the same people. Babylon is just the capital city of Chaldea. And so the Chaldeans rise to power, and King Nebuchadnezzar comes and he attacks Judea. And he then takes away Jehoiakim. He takes away the king and he establishes a new king. This is something that people would do when they would conquer a kingdom. They would decide, hey, you don't get to be king. This person's going to be king. It would just be a way to assert their authority. So he takes away Jehoiakim, takes him into captivity, and he establishes Jehoiachin. That's a different person. Jehoiachin as the king in his place. But Jehoiachin, he tried to rebel against King Nebuchadnezzar. So then King Nebuchadnezzar comes and he takes Jehoiachin away and he establishes Zedekiah as king in his place. So right away we have 4 different kings just in a few years right after Josiah. And these kings, once again, in order, Eliakim, his name is changed to Jehoiakim, and then Jehoiachin, and then Zedekiah. And Zedekiah is the last king of Judea before the Israelites go into captivity. Zedekiah is primarily the one that Jeremiah was going and talking to. Jeremiah was the one who's pleading with Zedekiah to allow God now to discipline Israel because they had failed. To not resist the punishment, but to recognize that Nebuchadnezzar was actually God's instrument of discipline. But Zedekiah resists and resists and resists, and he suffers a terrible fate because of it. It says this in 2 Chronicles 36:13, talking about Zedekiah. It says, he also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear allegiance by God. He became obstinate and hardened his heart against returning to the Lord, the God of Israel. So Zedekiah, he hardens his heart against God by resisting King Nebuchadnezzar. Sometimes God sends discipline into our life. And when we resist that discipline, we make it worse for ourselves. And that's exactly what happens with Zedekiah. But it doesn't end there. In the next verse, verse 14, it says, all the leaders of the priests and the people multiplied their unfaithful deeds. It's going from worse to worse. They're being punished, and they just keep on pursuing their sin, imitating all the detestable practices of the nations, and they defiled the Lord's temple that had consecrated in Jerusalem. So now they're doing despicable things in the temple. They're actually worshiping false gods in the temple itself. Verse 15, but the Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word against them by the hand of his messengers, sending them time and time again, for he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. See, God, he's slow to anger. He's abounding in steadfast love. When we see that, as he sends messenger after messenger to Israel, to Judea, to Jerusalem, and what do? They reject his messengers. Verse 16, but they kept ridiculing God's messengers, despising his words, and scoffing at his prophets, until the Lord's wrath was so stirred up against his people that there was no remedy. And that's where we find ourselves at the end of 2 Chronicles. There's no remedy. In verse 19, then the Chaldeans burned God's temple. Yesterday, Jason shared with you in Ezekiel how Ezekiel saw the glory of the Lord leave the temple. After God's glory left the temple, there was no protecting it. And God allows the Chaldeans to come in and destroy it, to utterly destroy the temple. And this shows the Israelites that God has completely, in this moment, he has forsaken dwelling among them. He has handed them over to their captors, and their only hope now is to cry out for mercy. Verse 20, he deported those who escaped from the sword to Babylon, and they became servants to him and his sons until the rise of the Persian kingdom. This fulfilled the word of the Lord through Jeremiah, and the land enjoyed its Sabbath rest all the days of the desolation until 70 years were fulfilled. So let me explain to you really quickly what it means when it says the land enjoyed its Sabbath rest. Part of God's requirement for the children of Israel going into the promised land was every seventh year they were supposed to allow their fields to lie fallow. They weren't supposed to sow any wheat in their fields. They're supposed to trust God to provide for them. You see, in the wilderness wanderings, when God was giving them manna from heaven, they developed this relationship with God where they were absolutely depending upon him for everything. And God recognized that they needed to continue to rest in him. And so he commanded them, when you come into the land every seventh year, don't plant anything. I'll give you enough to last for 2 years every sixth year. And so they rejected God by not allowing the land to lie fallow. And so what God does here when he punishes them, he says the land needs to now lie fallow for 70 years to make up for all those Sabbath years that you missed. You know, what God was calling them to was rest. What he's punishing them for is not depending on him. What we need to be constantly reminding ourselves is our need for dependence. But in the midst of that, God had sent Jeremiah not just as this hairbringer of doom, but as this herald of a promise. And God said, yeah, you're going to go in captivity, but it's only going to last for 70 years. And then I will bring you back. And we have this in verse 22. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah, the Lord roused the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia to issue a proclamation throughout his entire kingdom, and also to put it in writing. This is what King Cyrus of Persia says. The Lord, the God of the heavens, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed me to build him a temple at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord, his God, be with him. Do you hear the words of King Cyrus? God raises up this foreign pagan king, and he says, God has told me it's time for Israel to go home and build their temple. And then you hear his words, and that God may be with them. You see, while God's presence left the temple, his spirit never left his people. He was right there in the midst of them, protecting them with his prophets, with Ezekiel, with Daniel, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, with Esther and Mordecai. We have these faithful followers. And then God's going to raise up Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel to go back and to build. God always preserves a remnant. Jason shared that with you yesterday. So while his presence left the temple, his spirit didn't leave his people. But we need to remember that in any moment, no matter what's happening, God is always working out all things together for the good of them who love him, who are called according to his purpose. Even in the most darkest times of our history, God is working to see his people come to know him more. And I want you to remember that we follow a covenant-keeping, promise-making God. And he's promised to send his son, and he did. And he's promised to return, and he will. I hope that your heart is filled with hope this Christmas season. Thanks for listening.